Hello, everybody. This is Robert K. Elder. I am president of the Chicago Headline Club. And this is our third stab at this. This is our amazing video conference called Covering Communities in Crisis, Cooked: Survival by Zip Code in the COVID-19 Pandemic. Again, I am president of the Chicago Headline Club, and we got this together, this sort of special event with a focus on journalism's role in informing policy and framing these critical conversations around emergencies and race and all how that works together. And so I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. But I wanted to begin with a quote from Judith's documentary. And that comes from the author of the book, Eric Klinenberg. The title of the book was Heatwave: A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. And Eric started by talking about the 1995 heat wave, and that killed 739 people in 1995. And if you see the disparities between the victims in Chicago for both the coronavirus pandemic and the heat wave, the map is almost identical. So the quote I wanted to lead with from Eric was, "We study death in order to understand it and to better protect life." So I want to introduce our panelists. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Judith, and then go to Maudlin, and then to Andy, and then I will circle back. So Judith, go ahead.
My name is Judith Helfand. I'm a documentary filmmaker and an educator based in New York City. I live on the Upper West Side, and I'm sheltering in place in 10024. And I say that because the tagline to this movie is survival by zip code. And that's really true. I think about that every day when we wake up, every day when I go out, not every day, every few days if I do, to go out to the grocery store. Every day when I get the communications from my daughter's school, which is, 11 blocks away, and is trying as hard as it can to help us homeschool our kids. Mm-hmm. And it's a zip code that's going to survive, and it's going to do pretty well. And I know that already. Mm-hmm. That's a painful reality in the midst of all of this.
Judith, thank you so much. So I'm just going to go really quick. I forgot what the order was next, but let's go with Maudlin.
Andy. Maudlin, go ahead.
Okay, great. So I'm Maudlin Ihedjerika, and I am a urban affairs reporter and columnist at the Chicago Sun-Times. I've been with the Sun-Times about 26, 27 years. And I cover all of the issues that we are discussing tonight, primarily race and equity issues across all spectrums of the inner city, from education to crime, violence, to healthcare, to disinvestment and economic health of a community. And so I am, watching the exact same phenomena that we witnessed in the heat wave of 1995 play out in COVID-19 on the south and west sides of Chicago, and it is devastating.
And Maudlin, really quick, so one of the reasons you're with us is you covered the heat wave, earlier in your career. And so was that for the Sun-Times?
Yes, I joined the Sun-Times in '87, and in 1995, the heat wave struck, and I was still pretty green around the ears, and I remember walking around in a daze, just floored.
And Andy, you also covered the heat wave, but for television.
I did. My name is Andy Nebel, and I own a video production company in Chicago. For 13 years, I was doing television and radio news. My last stop in the country was at Channel 7 in Chicago, at ABC 7 in Chicago. And one of the stories I covered was the heat wave of 1995.
Mm-hmm. And so Judith is a New Yorker. She lives in New York. And so I'll just ask Judith, what brought you to this story?
Well, I was working on a film about climate crisis or climate change at the time. We call it climate crisis now, climate change messengers. And most of the messengers that we wound up following we're staying up late at night trying to figure out how do I communicate the climate crisis to the world so that they will act and do something. And believe it or not, that was in 2003 and 4. And in the process of following, a journalist and a writer and an author and a climatologist and a meteorologist who worked on TV, and some activists, I came across this book, and I read this book, and I hadn't heard about the heat wave. I was shocked that I couldn't actually quite remember it. It was the most harrowing thing I had ever read as it related to climate change at the time, and it took place in a city, and that story was sort of so extraordinary, and yet we couldn't quite fit that in this long form movie that we were making about all these various climate change messengers. And I had this feeling and that, it sort of needed its own movie. And I was just so shocked by what I learned and this idea that an extreme weather event could be the thing that could help people like me sort of see the underlying extreme disparity and inequity and that slow motion public health disaster that is taking place every single day, that it takes an event like that for us to see and to learn very, very, very harsh lessons. So that was why I was interested in the book and why I reached out to Eric to talk about turning it into a film.
And so for Maudlin and Andy, what was it like reporting this story just day to day?
Well, I remember that when the heat wave struck, I think I was covering housing and urban affairs at the time, and public housing was a huge issue nationwide. And so I remember when the heat wave struck, I was covering it from, the basic, what are people doing to stay cool perspective, trying to find various angles to that. And then the deaths started occurring. And at first they appeared to be these fluke deaths, and then they started to pile up. And now the entire newsroom was focused on covering these deaths. And I would go to sites where the fire department was removing bodies. And I remember feeling like it was an out-of-body experience, that the people in those black bags, these were human beings. These weren't just bags being carried out of 3 flats and 6 flats and huge buildings, apartment buildings, and public housing on the south and west sides. And I remember just being in a daze that people are dying of heat, and the very thought that they were in that apartment burning up to the point where they died left me so devastated that I could barely cover that story. And I remember feeling like too many people in Chicago were looking at the story or covering the story, I would even say, from a perspective of numbers. But for me, as an African-American reporter, watching this play out in Black communities, I was significantly overwhelmed by the fact that these were bodies, people's aunts, mothers, uncles, fathers, brothers, sisters. It was one of the most difficult, it was one of the first very difficult stories that I covered and where I felt emotionally drained.
Mm-hmm. And the statistics were just, again, incredible. More than 700 folks died. They had, was it 9, Judith? Was it 9 freezer trucks that they backed up to the morgue? Is that how many it was? Yeah, 9 semi-tractor trailers. And the documentary is particularly powerful because Judith puts it in this metaphorical language that we can understand. Like, the body count was so big and the tragedy was so big, it was as if 2 jumbo liners crashed in midair. That's how many people died.
I have to, I mean, as I'm hearing Maudlin talk, I'm getting goosebumps because I can remember it myself. And, you know, I was one of those white reporters out there covering this terrible tragedy. One of these white reporters that found himself almost every single day in the south and west sides of this city covering tragedy after tragedy. This was a tragedy of you know, so much larger. And for me, the moment when it really hit me was once when I was live on the air. It was early on when live on the air, I saw 5 refrigerated trucks being brought over to the morgue. My live shot was in front of the morgue. And at that moment, it was like, oh, this is a huge, huge story. But once again, I was this white guy covering this. I didn't have this connection that Maudlin had with that personal connection that Maudlin was feeling. I was covering it as a reporter, and oh, this is a big story. We need to be covering this story.
And one of the things that Judith points out is just the map of the deaths. And if you look at that map today, you know, it's south and west sides, the poorest neighborhoods. And if you look at the COVID map today, it's almost the exact same. You know, Maudlin's done a lot of reporting on this for the Chicago Sun-Times, and just that disparity. But Judith, can you tell us just a little bit to connect the two, and then just talk about why people died in that heat wave?
You know what? My everything froze in the middle of your question, so I'm not really sure what you're asking me to connect.
First, why don't you, if you can, why don't you talk to us about why people died in the heat wave?
Well, why did they die in the heat wave? You know, personally, I'd rather hear why Maudlin and Angie how they would answer that, to tell you the truth.
Okay, Maudlin. Oh, Maudlin, you're on mute. Just a minute. All right, go ahead.
People died in that heat wave for the exact same reason that people are dying today. They died in that heat wave because they live in communities that have long since been forgotten by the powers that be. They died in that heat wave because they live in communities that are plagued by poverty and by violence, and where businesses, jobs, employment, resources had long since been removed. And so therefore, you had elderly people who were locked up in apartments and homes with no air conditioning, too poor to afford air conditioning, and too fearful to open their windows and get the hot air, albeit it was hot air, but too fearful because of the violence that filled their communities. There was one scene in Judith's documentary that really struck me. And it was an elderly woman when the city finally began to send people out to work with people and to knock on people's homes and do well-being checks. And they were in her home and they asked her to open the window. And she said she lives on the first floor. And they said, yeah, well, you can get some air. And she said, yeah, well, if you just let the, if you just have the screen. And she said, yeah, but a knife can get through that screen. And she was fearful of opening her window to get air that would keep her alive because people might climb in her window and kill her or otherwise harm her. That is unacceptable in Chicago. That is unacceptable in America. That is the reason people died, because we have forgotten about a whole segment of the population, and we created the situations in these communities Because when you pull out jobs, when you pull out resources, going all the way back to redlining, you have communities that have long since imploded upon themselves. And so now you have all of these things that have combined to create health disparities. And the elderly people we saw dying were suffering from the same underlying conditions that they're suffering from now. Hypertension, diabetes, asthma. My community suffers from those conditions at a higher rate than other communities. And it is by design. It is not the fault of the community. It is because they live in these communities where racism kills.
And I would say that, so, you know, as journalists, we're taught in Journalism 101 about the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and why. And I would say that too often, journalists are covering the first 4 W's, and they're not covering the last W, the why. And yeah, we cover the why in a drunk driving accident. We cover the why in some simple, not covering the why in these bigger issue stories. And if you're not covering the why, these bigger issue stories, then you're never going to get to the answer. You're never going to get to the change in policies, the change in society that's going to stop these from happening.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And again, for those of you who have not seen the documentary, it's very powerful. And one of the things that Judith does is she goes in to these sort of emergency preparedness drills, whether it be for a tornado or an earthquake, and just points out there's millions of dollars going into preparedness drills for things that might not happen, or they kill one person on average, but nothing seems to address extreme pernicious poverty. So I wanted to be prescriptive about this and ask Judith and all of our panelists about this. Then what are the concrete policy or budgetary changes could be made to address extreme pernicious poverty?
Wow. I mean, that's a big question. I just want to point out, it's not that I think that disaster preparedness is all that necessarily like well-funded, right? I mean, but it's the only agency that I saw that had disaster or emergency in its title. Now, one thing, I mean, I think that, first of all, you know, today or yesterday in New York City, somebody funded the Blue Angels, who appear in Chicago, which is an annual air show. Yeah. Somebody funded the Blue Angels to fly over Manhattan and Brooklyn because they wanted to salute the frontline workers. Now, I don't know how much money that must have cost, but just like any of those air shows or a lot of these big events that take place, clearly we need to practice for certain kinds of disasters. I understand that. But I absolutely know that we are spending way too much, certainly on the military and certainly on traditional disaster preparedness measures that we could absolutely be using to invest in what we know right now are some of the core frontline institutions that are addressing the everyday needs of people right now during this pandemic and during a heat wave. So the anchor or institutions that wind up becoming frontline organizations and have to pivot during a disaster are the very same ones that are addressing the economic development, that are addressing food insecurity, that are trying to create, you know, jobs and are trying to use extraordinary innovation to address the systemic inequity that's going on in the very same communities that have the same amount of heat deaths and are having this amazing amount of COVID-19 deaths. Now, I'm not saying that grassroots institutions should shoulder the burden, but I do think they represent the kind of serious investment that has to be made in the communities that have been divested for generations, divested from. So for me, like, that's when we have to start thinking about disaster preparedness or creating a heat emergency plan for this incoming summer. we really have to be thinking about what is going to address the systemic inequity that determines.
She may have frozen. Oh, Judith, would you restate your last line? Something that determines.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm saying that we don't need a pandemic for us to understand. I'm sorry, it says my internet connection is unstable. We don't need a pandemic for us to understand how we need to reinvest in the communities that we have divested from for generations and generations. And if we actually address, real jobs that pay real wages, and if we invest in healthcare and childcare, and we make sure that we have really good schools and really good libraries, we will start to address and change the inequity that actually determines who lives and dies every day, regardless of the extreme weather or a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And one of the figures that I forget who brought it up in your documentary, you'll know who this is immediately, but he talked about the figures of people who die from preventable causes every year in Chicago, 3,200.
Dr. Whitman.
Yes, and he talks about, that figure being close to the number of people who died in 9/11 every year. And so that was,
and at that moment in time, that was a huge number.
Yeah.
But we're looking at really, really big numbers right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's
like
68% of the coronavirus deaths or something like that in Chicago are African-American people, and African-American people only make up like 30% of the population. So, right, it's huge numbers.
Yeah. And right now, folks, just to put this in its proper place and time, in Cook County, 1,347 deaths as of today, and we have 31,000, almost 32,000 known cases. As a state, we are over 50,000 cases.
So those numbers. Let's look at Illinois. So you have 50,355 cases and 2,215 deaths. African Americans, who make up only 15% of the population, currently represent 35.9% of the deaths. They are dying at a rate more than twice their population across the country. It's not just in Illinois, versus Hispanics and whites and Asians. In Chicago, you have 873 deaths. At 30% of the city's population, that's more than 50%, 54.2% of the deaths are African American versus Latinx, white, and Asian. So why is this happening? What can be done, as you said? One of the things that the individuals, one of the experts that I talked to said to me, there is nothing short of a Marshall Plan is going to change what is happening across America. And the results we see during a crisis, when African Americans and predominantly people of color, but primarily right now, African Americans die at unacceptable rates that become accepted as the norm. And so when we talk about the Marshall Plan, what is the Marshall Plan for poverty? Well, we have to look at the very beginning. When we look at the reason why African Americans are dying in COVID-19, minority workers are overrepresented among essential workers in transit, in service, in grocery stores, in maintenance, and so forth. Lower levels of socioeconomic status mean that Blacks and other minorities are more likely to continue to work outside the home when shelter-in-place directives are given. And in these poor neighborhoods, social distancing is not a viable option when you reside in high-density, often multi-generational housing units in segregated communities. This particular public health official says that segregation is one of the #1 culprits for the inequities that we are seeing across the country. Segregation meaning you put communities of color off on one side of the city and you forget about them. You pull the businesses out, you pull the hospitals out. Many studies have shown that the higher the level of segregation, the more likely that the hospitals have long since exited. You pull out grocery stores so that now they live in food deserts and there is not nutritional food to be found anywhere. And now you talk about poverty. So where does a child that is raised in the ghetto, where do they end up? What is their potential? What are their possibilities? Well, if you don't do something to address it at its core, the possibilities will end up among essential workers, in transit, in service, in grocery stores, in maintenance, etc. We have to do something to raise the bar. We have to do something to raise the economic ladder in these communities. We have to address poverty from the beginning. And in fact, I will say that one of the key things that has been identified as the way you begin to address poverty is early education, early childhood education. If you give a child support and education and resources from the beginning, they have a greater likelihood to avoid the criminal justice system, to avoid low-wage jobs, to avoid all of these things that end up stacking the deck against them. So we have to start from the beginning.
Yeah, and
so,
I would say
Andy, I'm sorry, just really quick. I was trying to get in there because there's a bunch of comments. One of them is, can we vote for you for president, Maudlin? I'm sorry, Andy, go ahead.
I vote for Maudlin for president.
So do
I vote for Maudlin to go to DC and take over right now.
Oh yeah, right.
I vote for Maudlin to write stories that are gonna get to Lori Lightfoot and President Krackwinkle.
Oh, we're losing you again, Judith. So I want to backfill just a little bit while we're waiting for the Wi-Fi to come back.
Okay.
Maudlin talked about the Marshall Plan, and for those of us who are not all historians, Marshall Plan was the U.S.'s plan and support system to help out Western Europe after World War II. $15 billion. So a modern Marshall Plan would look something like that. Judith, we have you back. Go ahead and finish, please.
I was just saying, I don't really want Maudlin to go to Washington, D.C. I want her ideas to be put in place at the city, county, and state level and used as a model for the rest of the country. And I think right now, with a Black woman in charge of the city and another in charge of the county, it's the right time to lead the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, there you go, Maudlin.
So I want to ask a couple of questions just very quickly. We advertise this as 40 minutes, but we'll go probably over an hour. And I want to open it up to questions, and we already have questions in the chat. But I wanted to ask, we'll start with Maudlin and Andy. And Andy, I'll ask you to go first. What did you learn while reporting on this story, and how did it change your life?
Okay, that was a big question. Wait, can I just, since we're going a little long anyway, I just want to address something that Maudlin said. I just want to pick up on that, so I'm going to do it. So,
what do you think this is, the presidential debate?
Yeah. We have to move. We have to move to a society that believes that raising everyone up makes us a stronger society.
Exactly.
It doesn't make us weaker by embracing everybody and raising everybody up. That's how we become a stronger society.
Right.
The other thing that I think needs to be done as journalists is we need to hold the powers that be accountable. We have to, when we're covering a story like the heat wave or the pandemic, we have to then bring that question, bring these important questions, the why questions, to our leaders and say, this is going on. What are you going to do to change it? as opposed to just reporting what's happening right now. That's just my follow-up to Maudlin.
That's great. That's great.
And then in terms of your question, I've been thinking about this. And for me, going into the South and West Sides, going into those areas that were in the Cooked documentary every single day, I came to realize that we were just covering what was happening instead of why it was happening. And the heat wave for me was really when the light went on. It was like, oh, this is the way things are done in this market. Because I'd only been in Chicago less than a year when I first started, when the heat wave happened. So for me, it was sort of like this, oh, this is the way this is going to be. And it really was a change for me in terms of whether I really wanted to be in local news anymore after it, because I realized if my goal was to raise the consciousness of society, how much was I doing? What were we doing as journalists, going out there and feeding this negativity every single night to these populations without giving them the why? And if I may, I was covering one story somewhere on the South Side where somebody had a hand grenade. And we all ran down there to cover this story. And a little boy looked up at me and he said to me, "Why do you only come into my neighborhoods when bad things happen?"
Right.
And I felt like crying at that moment. And for me, it's not that we shouldn't go into the neighborhoods when bad things happen, but we should be doing it in a much more thoughtful way than how we're doing it. It's like, the light bulb, we go into the room, we turn the light bulb on to let everybody know something's going on, and then we leave the room. And the room's there with the light bulb on, but we're not in the room to do anything about it. So that's how the heat wave changed me.
Mm-hmm. So very, very powerful. Maudlin, same question. What did you learn? How did it change you?
I think that, I think what I learned is best exemplified in the number of study after study, studies that have documented segregation's detrimental impact. One such study that really sticks out, and I would refer people to, is Harvard economists David Cutler and Edward Glacier's 1997 study, Are Ghettos Good or Bad? This particular study showed that in a national sample of African Americans and whites, if we could erase residential segregation overnight, we would completely eliminate all African American / white differences in income, education, unemployment, and even factors as off the grid in terms of income, in terms of neighborhoods, as single motherhood. So what that says to me is, when we leave people, particularly the marginalized, in communities with no resources, and we don't look back to see how they are surviving, how they are existing, this is what I learned, you get people aging in place in their 70s, 80s, 90s. I'll stop there to say, in Judith's film, there were 42 corpses, I believe, that were buried in a potter's field at the end of that heat wave because no one claimed the bodies. And that's in Judith's film. So when you get people aging in place with no family, okay, and then with no resources, poor, no hospitals, no access to health care, no one to care for their homes. The homes are running down, dilapidated. You are going to end up with the sorts of disasters that occurred in 1995's heat wave. That's what I learned when I saw these older people frying, let's use the word, in their own homes because they were too poor to afford air conditioning, because there are no libraries, because there are no no restaurants that they can go to get a little respite from the heat, because they can't open their windows, because the crime level in Inglewood, where there were so many of the deaths, in Garfield Park, where there were so many of the deaths, in North Lawndale, where there were so many of the deaths, is way up. So they have to fear for their lives, and they can't take care of their health because there are no hospitals. Those are the things I learned occur when we create the sorts of communities that we have created on the south and west sides of Chicago. It's basic. And might I add that someone said, we have to report the whys so that there can be change. I would digress and say, some of us do report the whys. I report the why all day, 7 days a week, and still there is no change. There was no change after the heat wave. There was no change after the book. There was no change after Judith's film, and there has still been no change. Otherwise, we would not be staring down a pandemic that is increasingly cloaking itself in darker hues.
Madeline, thank you so much. Judith, I would not want to follow that, but it is your turn. What did you learn? How did it change your life? How did this film, how did looking to this change your life? Oh.
It's not over. It's actually not over. You know, I mean, you know, what can I say? It's made me think about zip code, and it's made me think about inequity and disparity in a radically different way. I mean, I'm a different person than when I started the movie. First of all, I'm the mother of a little girl who happens to be Black and Jewish. So, you know, now I have a multiracial household, and I really have to answer to her. I'm going to have to answer her whys, and they're going to get increasingly complicated. They already are starting to be. I mean, they really are. And, oh, here she comes. And, hi, nothing. So,
does she want to say
everything's
hello?
fine. Do you want to say hi? No. She doesn't want to talk to strangers tonight. It's okay. So,
tell her that she
right.
met us before.
You actually met them before. It's cool. So, you know, I have to increasingly answer questions. Is why are all the homeless people? Why are most of the homeless people? Mom, what's going on? Why? Excuse me. You know what? And you know, that's just in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
That we see a lot of disparity and inequity just in the city that I live in. So how did it change my life? It changed my life because I've been making first-person movies for a long time, but inserting myself in this film and trying to utilize my voice, my platform, to be able to sort of take the white community with me and to really look at this story and then look back on where they live and what it takes to go to the other side of town and when and why, and what does it mean to live in a city and to live in cities that have such acute disparity and to not be a part of that change, to not even know that that might be existing, to be asking very hard questions of where we live and who's dying and who's not dying, and what will this summer look like? What will this summer mean when when the climate crisis truly collides with this pandemic? So the movie taught me to ask these questions in very hard ways. So I you know, the answer of how has it changed my life certainly isn't over. I'm learning from this all the time. I'm learning about my responsibility as a filmmaker, learning about my responsibility as a citizen, learning about my responsibility as a mother of a Black young girl who'll be a woman. Yeah. I don't know yet.
Judith, thank you so much. And we have we're sort of at the end of the official time, but I will keep this on for the next 20 minutes, and we'll have questions. And Melissa had a very sort of powerful question. So Melissa, you are unmuted and your camera's on.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for such a great panel. I wasn't planning to even come and show my face, so sorry if I look pretty horrible right now, but I did want to ask a question. Madeline, first off, thank you so much for your passion and honesty about the heat wave and the pandemic. You know, the heat wave happened when I was not even a year old, so it's kind of cool to hear about just the coverage that went on and the actual event itself. And Andrew, going off of your first statement in the beginning of the talk, I did want to ask you about what you were talking about, the why, and why journalists need to cover the why more. So I wanted to ask you, why aren't more journalists covering the why during this pandemic? I wanted to know if you think if it falls on the shoulders of the reporter individually, or the news organization, or something much greater and larger that maybe is or isn't out of our control.
It's a really good question. Well, I can talk about my experience, you know, as a TV reporter at Channel 7 during, you know, in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And, you know, to Madeline's point, Madeline is out there asking the why every single day. Mm-hmm. There are reporters out there asking the why every single day. I don't think it's enough. And I think part of it, at least in television news or even local television news, there are a lot of systemic reasons why people aren't asking the why. I would say that one is you have a certain number of people on staff that have to cover, that have to fill an enormous amount of time every single day on the air. And I would say that if they can get Andy to do a live shot at 4, 4:35, and 6, that they know that they've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of that time span filled, rather than, you know, taking Andy off the air for an entire day to investigate something and ask the why, or find legislators and ask them what they're going to do about something. I think there's also a competitive issue in television news, where, you know, every morning the editors are sitting in a morning meeting and they're looking at the ratings from the night before, and they're looking at it minute by minute. And if they look and they see that at 10 after, Channel 7's ratings went down by a hair to Channel 5 or to Channel 2 or to WGN, they're going to be asking why. And if it was because we went down because we were covering poverty on the South Side and Channel 5 and Channel 2 were covering a fire, then the assignment desk and the people who are making those immediate decisions know that there's pressure to make sure that if there's a fire going on, we better pull everybody off of that to go cover the fire. I mean, I covered stories like the Japanese ambassador apologizing for the first time on American soil for the treatment of American prisoners of war during World War II. And this happened in Chicago. And I was pulled off of that story to cover a car accident.
Wow.
So, you know, it gives you a sense that, you know, there's a lot of herd mentality in terms of how things are covered in local TV news. So that, you know, that's one reason. The other reason is they've got to fill a lot of time. And if they can figure out a way to fill 6 minutes, they're going to do it that way. So those are just a few reasons why the why isn't covered on a broader scale.
Sure. And Judith and Madeline, if you had any insight onto this too, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, if we have time, I guess.
Yeah, restate your question, please.
Yeah, so it was just basically, why aren't more journalists covering the why? Is it because of it? Does it fall on the shoulders of the journalists? Is it the responsibility of the news organization, or is it some greater issue?
You know, I mean, I don't know. Right now, I see a lot of journalists covering the why. I think that this is a different moment than the reporting that was going, to some extent. It was a different moment than the reporting that was going on in 1995. There was a different mayor in Chicago in 1995. And I think I can only imagine that he wasn't interested in having the newspapers really, truly covering the why 150%. And that he was using the press to redirect the press so that it became an argument, you know, between him and the medical examiner about how many deaths there really were, because he didn't want that number to be escalating in the way that it ultimately did, or that it was. But right now, I don't know, you all could, don't you think that you see more analysis about what this pandemic is really revealing all across this country? I think so. Do you?
Well, you know, one of the things that we have to look at is that we're seeing the exact same arch, news-wise, with the COVID-19 pandemic as we saw with the heat wave. That is, first the numbers start, we have deaths, and we're all following the numbers. We're all following COVID-19, just like we were all following the heat wave and the numbers. Oh, a few people died. Oh, wow, you know, this is an aberration. It's a sexy story. And then, but it's still just about the heat wave. COVID-19, we're just focused on this horrible thing that we have never seen before. And then, suddenly, someone says, hey, wait a minute. Let's look at who's dying. And guess what? The majority of the people dying are African American. But that happened after a little time. I will, to the mayor's credit and to Governor Pritzker's credit, the first volley nationwide regarding the disproportionate numbers of African Americans who were dying from this disease occurred right here in Chicago. And then after that, of course, because of that herd mentality that Andrew pointed out, nationwide, everyone says, oh, there might be a story here. New York, let's take a look at who's dying here. Oh my God, it's the same population. Let's look over here. Michigan, oh my God. So now the story becomes another story. So what I'm saying to you is it's the same arch. It happened with the heat wave, and it took a while for us to recognize that there were a disproportionate number of African Americans who were dying in this heat wave. And so there's always a slow catch up. And the other thing that to note here is that all disasters follow the same arch. So in the heat wave, there was this whole, fight by Mayor Daley to ignore and avoid and discredit the large numbers that were coming out of people who died. You know why? Because then that means you gotta acknowledge that you've got people in segregated communities who have been forgotten and left to fry in their homes because of poverty, right? Okay, so there was that. And then later on, there was this recognition that there were extraordinary numbers of deaths during that period versus the same time period the year before. And therefore, it was realized that, hey, even the numbers that we are reporting must be much higher. We must have a higher number that actually died. That's happening now. The New York Times just reported that there were these extraordinary numbers of deaths versus the same time period last year. And now we're all saying, oh my God, we must have a much higher number of COVID-19 deaths than we actually realize. So all disasters follow the same arch. The question becomes, what do we do about it in the aftermath? We did nothing in the aftermath of the heat wave, and we're back at square one. Why aren't we covering the whys? I think that so many news entities, as Andrew just pointed out, are under the constrictions of an industry that is downsizing, that is dealing with the effects of the impact of the internet. And so we've seen a survival of the fittest in terms of newspapers, in terms of broadcast, TV, radio. All of these news entities are having to reinvent themselves and find new ways to survive. The ones who are surviving, they are looking for the fire and any other story that is going to hold viewers. Unfortunately, poverty ain't sexy. Poverty has always been with us. It was Jesus himself who said the poor will always be with us. Unfortunately, America has taken that to heart, meaning who cares? They'll always be here. We don't have to do anything about them. So that's why you don't find news entities covering poverty and the whys the way that we should. Mm-hmm. But some of us are. The question is, what happens when we do?
Yeah.
Nothing is happening, and that's got to change.
Mm-hmm. So again, very powerful, Maudlin. I want to paraphrase a couple of questions that have come up here. We only have a few minutes left. One of our attendees asked, so what are the steps from, this critical reporting to have an impact on actual policy change? What needs to happen?
Judith, I'll turn that over to you for your thoughts.
What has to happen? Well, first of all, I mean, we have a really interesting opportunity facing us right now. Soon it will be the summer. The city has to think about whether or not we're going to have a traditional heat emergency plan or we're going to have a human emergency plan. What is the extreme heat coupled with the pandemic going to look like? Are we going to really close the lakes and the pools? What are we really going to do? What's going to happen when we are pushing people to isolate, when in fact isolation in the face of extreme heat, we know can cause incredible death? So, what has to happen? I think that we have to look at this deep inequity. We have to look at a lot of the brilliant solutions and strategies that are absolutely underfunded, and we can't look at them as the big major solution, but we could look at them as models, and those models are taking place on the south and west sides of the city by really brilliant and innovative thinkers who are using a systems approach to try to address inequity. And I'm talking about like RAGE and Amman and Grow Greater Inglewood and Growing Home, and these really brilliant grassroots organizations that have grown up and in the face of the extreme inequity and have been the ones who've been racing to address poverty as if it is the disaster and emergency that it is every single day, regardless of the weather or the pandemic, but are having to pivot and become frontline relief workers in the face of this pandemic. When we put them at the same table as the people who do disaster preparedness and as the people who are looking at, job and economic innovation and are looking at sort of the Green New Deal, like they can help direct the kind of Marshall Plan that has to happen in those neighborhoods that were redlined so many years ago. And they can help direct the kind of major league investment that has to take place, but it has to be done like with a local grassroots understanding, but on a major level. So when policy can help be directed by the people who understand the neighborhood and who live there and who have created the trusted social networks that are saving people's lives right now as I speak, like when those people are helping to create and construct policy, we will have policy that has heart and compassion and empathy and real strategic thinking that is not racist at heart, that really puts the people first. So, we can't have policy unless those people are helping to write it. Mm-hmm. But the big question for me is, what do we do with the 25th anniversary this summer? One thing I can tell you is that journalists are willing to look at the why on an anniversary if you give them the right way to frame it. But people have to report on anniversaries. 25th anniversary of this heat wave is going to happen at the same time as this pandemic is either getting worse or slowly maybe sort of getting better. And then they're going to say, oh, the crisis is ebbing. And our job is going to be able to say, no, the crisis is not going anywhere. The underlying crisis is there and killing people every single day. So how we use that 25th anniversary, I think this summer could really help direct policy. But we can't wait for July because people are going to really be dead then. So Madeline and Andy, what do you think? How do we use this 25th anniversary, which I think is really a critical one?
And to our guests, succinctly, please. We're almost out of time.
Well, I want to ask Madeline. Madeline, you're on the beat every single day these days. What is your, and this can also address Judith's question. What is your feeling from City Hall? What is your feeling from Lori Lightfoot and her people about what they want to do about these issues?
What I will say in closing is that race matters. And we are in a historic position with the very first African-American female mayor of Chicago ever, and only the second African-American mayor. If we did not have an African-American mayor, we would never have seen the mayor of Chicago only months, scant months before the pandemic hit Chicago and the nation, announce a war on poverty. Mayor Lightfoot announced a war on poverty that is equivalent to a moonshot. It's a cancer moonshot, and people laughed. But this was in February or January, and she said, we cannot continue on with the pockets of the West Side and pockets of the South Side the way they are today. We have to bring all our resources together to find a way to lift up these communities. We cannot rest until children in these communities have the same opportunity. You know, a January report by Brandeis University found that that ranks almost every US neighborhood, found that race is a predictor of whether a child lives near good schools, healthy foods, parks and playgrounds, and living wage jobs. Low opportunity neighborhoods were linked to lower life expectancy and lower economic mobility. And in the Chicago metropolitan area, 81% of African-American children and 61% of Latino children live in what's called low or very low opportunity neighborhoods versus 12% of white children. And so therefore, Mayor Lightfoot is on the right track. I believe that City Hall is finally on the right track. We have a mayor who hopefully these issues resonate with, because let's call it what it is, race matters. And so hopefully the resources that she is trying to bring to the South and West sides in terms of economic development, in terms of food, in terms of all of these things will make a difference. And that, I think, is where we have to start.
And unfortunately, folks, that's where we have to stop because we're at time. So thanks to our panelists, Madeline, Judith, and Andy. Tell your friends, this is going to be posted online, the same link that you signed up through. Again, my name is Robert K. Elder. I am president of the Chicago Headline Club. I'm also the chief digital officer for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So thank you again. And if you don't have our newsletter where you hear about all of this sort of stuff, we try to have monthly, or in this case, bi-weekly programs. Please find it on our website. And thank you again. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Bye, Robert.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye, Madeline. Bye,
Thanks.
Andy.
Bye, Judith. Bye, Andy.
Bye, Bridget.
Madeline, I'll see you
Wait,
around.
when this is all over, can we have a drink of tea?
Yes.
Something? All right.